Listen, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot express enough how important it is to be mindful as you are listening to this podcast. This is one where we're going to be talking about some really hard things as gracefully and as honest and gentle as we possibly can, while keeping things in perspective, while keeping an open mind, while realizing that we have yet to arrive and there's more to learn. So if you're coming with a posture of defensiveness, this might be a great place to stop because that's really not going to serve you here, and it would be of disservice to you to allow you to continue with that defensiveness. And no feelings hurt there. Maybe this isn't the time for us to have this conversation. And to the rest of my listeners, seriously, defensiveness is not going to work. My hope is that you maintain an openness as we're talking about these things, a grace as we too realize we don't have it all together. We're just sharing what we've learned up to this point and how it impacts us. And also a humility and a vulnerability that allows yourself to reflect on what we're talking about, but to also reflect on the thoughts that you have. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Peas in Progress podcast. Here, we'll share our experiences as a biracial millennial couple who got married in the South and what we've learned together through the current social and political climate.
All while learning to trust and love one another through what seems to be a life in transition. Welcome to our life.
I'm Brandon.
And I'm Amy Beth.
Hey friends, just a friendly notice. We want to let you know that this podcast will be adult friendly, including language and subject matter not suitable for younger ears. So if you have headphones, now would be a good time to use them.
Let's dive in. I'm glad that you said that. I have to say, as a white person I have to say with you as a white person that this is a very important conversation for white people to have. This is not Brandon's conversation to have with you guys. This is a conversation that we're having together. And we're doing this a little bit differently this time because we know that obviously different topics can go different places. And we know that there's probably going to be a lot of questions from this. Maybe you listeners who are brave that subscribe, hello. Please let us know what you think, because this is going to be our first topic that we dive into as a couple who has been through it. So I think the biggest question that we got, especially before we moved here, was how our relationship works.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we were dating, I got the question of how is that going to work? Especially with how your parents feel about that.
Mm-hmm.
That was the question that I got the most, which wasn't offensive to me at the time and still is not offensive, just because I know everyone's learning and we need to have grace with ourselves in this process. This is not something to get angry at ourselves about, because you don't know what you don't know. And once you know it, then you can do better. It's like falling off a bike. You wouldn't scream and yell at a kid for falling off a bike. And if you are screaming and yelling at your kids for falling off bikes, you need to calm down. Because there's no need for that. So this is not a screaming and yelling, we're mad at the world because people are racist.
Yeah, no.
Because we know that people are racist. We've known that people are racist. In fact, it wasn't really a big topic for us until after Brown in St. Louis happened.
Mm-hmm.
So
that and Tamir Rice and several other Trayvon Martin.
So these conversations have been just over the last, I don't know, the last 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Because it didn't start until after we moved. And then we moved to the southiest south you could go, which was Podunk, Monroe, Louisiana. I'll say it because I didn't like it.
Oh, man.
So there's been a huge difference in the way that life was there and the way that life is now. And I say it like that because I want you to picture a rainbow going over mountains with a sunset, because that's just the comparison of the life we've experienced from moving from the South to Colorado. I love Colorado for many reasons, So, Brandon, would you like to go first and talk about your perspective for you? Because I could probably name at least 3, 4, 5, 6 incidents of when things have been said to you, or you've been stopped by the police, or just because. So please enlighten us.
Oh my goodness. Let me just point out to those who might be coming into the middle of this. I am an African American. I am a person of color. I'm black. My wife is Caucasian. I'm white, of English and Irish descent.
Yes.
So we are already coming from two different worlds. Now, granted, I had already been exposed to this world because if you remember back from the previous podcast, I talked about extended family, kind of a pseudo family where they practically took me in and raised me as their own, and they were Caucasian, they were white. And so I was already exposed to that world, but for whatever reason, when it came to dating or this idea of marriage, then suddenly all hell breaks loose as far as questioning, as far as this doesn't seem right, as far as doubts, dismays. It was just the moment that door was open, people were just wanting to close it. And I don't think they were trying to intentionally close it. It was just their own fear because of not knowing discouraged what I wanted, in a sense. I wanted to be in a relationship with you.
Wait, so you had people telling you not to be in a relationship with me because of the color of my skin?
Yeah, but it wasn't an overt, like you said, don't do that because she's not black. They wouldn't overtly say that, but the tone that they would use and the language that they would use, that communicated more so in a covert way.
Can you give an example?
This is a bad idea.
Can you give a good example of what you were told? You don't have to say who said it.
For instance, how is she gonna help you to be able to raise kids? Or how is she going to understand your blackness? How is she going to not be racist? Those sort of things. Those were the questions that they were covertly asking, but overtly they would say things oh, well, it should be interesting how you guys raise kids, or oh, it'll be interesting to see how so and so in the family will handle them. It was just they were throwing up these warning signs don't do it, it's a trap.
So that was your family, and I'm gonna take it back to the topic of what is the difference between living in the North and the South, because I think you kind of got off on a little tangent there.
I did.
I don't even know why you're talking about that. Can you explain why you're talking about that?
Well, I was just talking about my experience in this interracial relationship, from the beginning.
Okay, so that's where we're starting.
Yeah, from the beginning, there's already these things working against me, and these things that I weren't fully aware were working against me because I was black and because you were white. Right.
Okay, so that's where we're starting.
Mm-hmm.
So what was my experience like? I think you already kind of said. They were what are your family gonna think? I notoriously dated outside of my race. In fact, I dated twice as many people of color than I did white people. So not as a badge of honor or anything, because that doesn't give me any credibility whatsoever. But I was just more attracted to people outside of my race, and it wasn't because of any particular reason. It was just I felt people of color were so much more down to earth than most white people I knew. And I was just on a different thinking level than most people around me. For some reason, it just felt good too. It just served me. It's just who I was attracted to.
Mm-hmm.
And this wasn't a huge deal to my friends. I think most of my friends were super supportive. I don't really remember any of my friends not being supportive. unless they didn't tell me. Maybe they said it behind my back. But, like, most of the friends that I knew in person at the time, because we lived in Abilene, were super excited for us. So, but Abilene was in the South, and we experienced some stuff there. We also experienced a lot of Louisiana, compared to where we live here. There's still been things here. It's not like rainbow sunshine all the time, because it's just not. That's just how the world is. But it was so much harder in Abilene and Louisiana. How was it difficult for you, Brandon?
I mean, just by myself, all of the, like, prejudice and discrimination, both, like, overt and covert in that sense. It felt like I was always having to face that. And I was always having to, like, be on my toes about it, while also trying to be in a relationship with a woman that represents the group of people that I'm daily having this battle with. And so it was really hard to shield the frustration and pain that I experienced from, like, essentially white people. Like, I had to, like, shield that from how I viewed you in our relationship, because our relationship really wasn't about race. Like, that never.
It was
really,
never about
like,
race.
That never.
It just really
came
worked
up.
out for me because that was my preference, but it was who you were and who I saw you as.
Right.
Like, I knew something about you the moment I saw you. Like, you can learn about that in our previous podcast. But that just goes to show, like, I saw you and I was like, yes, that dude right there. He's got something that most people don't. And I'm usually pretty intuitive. I would say that's one of my spiritual gifts. But being intuitive and knowing that there was something much more about you that I wanted to get to know, and I was totally right. So
yeah, and I mean, even as we were getting to know each other, like, I can't remember a conversation where we talked about.
We never even discussed race. Like, I don't remember discussing that as part of our dating experience. It wasn't until after we got together that we were starting to have more experiences. And it wasn't, they were very, very minute in the beginning. So, like, I didn't hardly notice them. I'm sure you probably noticed stuff that I didn't, but I thought it was nice and rosy in the beginning.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that speaks just to us and our naivety. Like, we didn't know much about these things. Like,
we hadn't super really in love.
Yeah, I mean, essentially.
We still are super in love. But
yeah, and I don't want to say that like blinded us to those things, because it was evident. I mean, small but evident. But I don't know. It's just like at that point of our journey, like, the research wasn't there, and it's like cool to like reflect on like how, since we've done the research and how we have been exposed to that, how like different we are because of it.
Yeah, and how much more aware we are. I think because we're so much more aware of it, it's just you become aware of it and it's there. And even on our recent vacation, there was a lot of things.
Oh my gosh.
There's so many things that were said that I was like, and this is why you live in Colorado. Because we just don't get that as much. It's just like, it becomes to a point where it's just like, okay, like, why I want to tell you to stop doing what you're doing and speaking words, but I don't feel like that's very nice. So it's just like, you have to kindly accept how the world is sometimes, and you can't fix everything. But we talked a little bit about, you kind of talked about how you protected me from the frustration of the tension that you were feeling between white people and your white girlfriend at the time, / I don't know, fiance, now then wife, lover. But I would say, to sum up the living in the South versus North thing, Louisiana was probably where my eyes were open to a lot more things. I think not only because I was more aware, but also it was just like the rosy glasses were handed over. Like, someone took them from me and was forcing me to see what was happening in front of me. And that was very tense of a time, because I worked in a very traditional white-owned graphic design agency. And they said and did things. They said things about Black people and people of color and of lower income communities that I was just appalled at. And I, wanting to earn my paycheck, just had to keep my mouth shut and talk to the people I trusted in that space, because I wasn't going to confront my boss about it, because we were really in need of money at the time. And I was also like, that was just not a fun job in general. And I was having a hard time during that period. And so it was just like, I was just trying to keep the peace as much as possible, because I knew that I was frustrating her in a lot of ways. So it was just a matter of really being shown, like, this is racism at its finest. And that was during the 2016 election. So that year prior up to that was really intense, because we lived in the South, and like we would go out places and people would say stuff to us, or they would look at us you could see the looks on people's faces. Like, hello, I have eyeballs. I'm right here. I can see you looking at me and pointing and like giving me weird ass eye contact. Like, it's very obvious. Like, it's just, I'm a details person. I notice those things. So that was really hard for me. And our church experience was really hard for me, because it seemed, we went to the church with the Duck Dynasty people. So like, not a dig on them, but like, no, it was just very impersonal the way that they came across. It was like, they were very much TV people. Like, they're the TV people that don't remember your names. And I'm sorry if I don't remember people's names either, but sometimes, I mean, it was just like, hello, there's one Black man right here with a girl with all purple hair. How do you not remember us? We were very noticeable, and we did get looks in church, and the people that loved us did love us and never said anything overtly racist. And I feel like they were very careful around us. Do you feel that way?
I did, because I didn't have a sense of unsafety per se.
Right.
There's more like caution, if anything. Just like making sure that I wasn't a threat, or that they didn't perceive like bad things about me, like that sort of thing, but never like a dangerous, like overtly racist kind of atmosphere.
Right. So it wasn't until I hung out with my friends that I hung out on a regular basis that I could talk about those things with them. And people my age were way more aware of that than the people that we would have issues with. So it wasn't all terrible either, because there were definitely people that got it, but it was like far and few between. Mm-hmm. So we traveled a lot. We left the state a lot. We went to Texas and Missouri a lot to see family, to get out of town, to get out of state, really. And just the lifting of the weight that we would feel when we left, it was very real. It was unreal at the same time. So we talked a little bit about the experience of our families. I feel like we pretty much covered that.
Yeah. My
immediate family, my mom and dad, were hesitant at first, because I had previously dated a Black man, and it did not work out at all, and did very badly and bitterly. So they were very hesitant in that regard, but not in regards of his color of his skin. My mom was just very like, does he have a job? And you did. So she was very impressed from the beginning. And they were just super impressed with your work ethic over anything. They didn't care. They were very excited that I had found somebody that had become my very best friend. So it was a pretty easy transition, surprisingly, into being married. So how does our marriage work now? It's working. I don't know. Currently, you're listening to it. So it's working. We're just very cautious of things. We're very aware now. We've educated ourselves on different things. We don't tend to stick to one side or the other. We're very in the middle when it comes to a lot of stuff. There are some things that I can be extreme about, but that's just because of my values and my priorities and the way that I see things and the things that I've learned, and being on the radio just really opens your eyes to a lot of things. So
And I think like we keep each other accountable too,
and we
like,
have lots of conversations. That's what you're
lots and lots of conversations. Because like there will be times where I think about something or I have an experience, and like she's the first person I go to make sense of it. And I think the same happens like the other way too. Like if you feel like you have a question, like you're struggling with something, like I'm usually the first person that you talk to about it.
Right, because you're my husband.
And you're my wife.
But also because you're a different color than me and you see things in a different lens that I can see sometimes. So So how would we describe our conversations with one another? I would say they're very open, they're very honest. I don't hold back anything, and I'm very open. Like, how would you describe me? Because I feel like my conversations with you are going to be much different than on our podcast. Because of what reason? Because they're very candid. They're not POC at all. And we make fun of our own races all the time. So it's just this back and forth, but it's all out of, we know each other. There's this rapport that we've built with each other, this respect. And if there is something that is said out of disrespect, whether that's about race or sex, we call it out and we talk about it. And it may or may not be a pretty conversation, but most of the time it's pretty cordial. We have very adult conversations with each other. A lot like how we're talking on this podcast is how we talk with one another.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a vulnerability to it. Like, I'm not afraid of being hurt for being open and honest about what I'm thinking or how I'm feeling or how I'm even wrestling with how do I even decide to think about this thing. So from you, I hear that often. Like, I don't get the sense that you're holding back or that you're not telling me certain things because you're afraid to offend me or you're afraid of something. There's just a vulnerability about it. And I think there's a humility about it too, because we come to this conversation knowing that we know some things, but also knowing that we don't know everything.
Yeah, so we're never all knowing. So even as we do this podcast, we're still learning. This is not we are the expert at this thing. This is not that, this is just our experience and how we see it and how we've dealt with it. So, and hopefully to encourage others on asking these questions, being open-minded. I was going to say too that just in closing this, like watching your experience as your wife, not only as your wife, but as a white woman who hears about these terrible stories of these things happening to Black men all the time, even before I was married to you, like hearing these stories, like, but seeing your experience and not just like hearing experiences, but seeing experience has become probably the ultimate eye-opener, because without you in my life, like there's no way I would be able to even talk about this right now. I'd probably still feel how a lot of my white friends feel now about race and, you know, fragile about it and like, I don't see color. Like, you know, like that, because I have said those things before. I have said those things. I have meant those things because that's what I knew, because, you know, like I just didn't know what I know now.
While the Great Migration had led to nearly exponential growth in the number of African Americans who called Detroit home, the area where they were supposed to live, Black Bottom, had never expanded. Realtors, insurance agents, banks, and landlords had devised a witch's brew of schemes and machinations, such as redlining and restrictive covenants to cordon off wide swaths of Detroit's housing stock from African Americans and carve a color line through the city. And so the small stretch of land called Black Bottom became engorged with 10 times the number of people it once held. Less than half of the homes in the ghetto in the making had indoor plumbing, although in the urban north a bathroom was the norm. More than 15% of families were forced to live in one-room apartments. Nearly 1/3 of all Black families were crammed into 4-room homes, but despite the clearly debilitating and disastrous effects of the brutal reality, Michigan's Supreme Court, relying on the precedents of Cruikshank, the civil rights cases, and Plessy, upheld racially restrictive housing policies as constitutional in Parmalee versus Morris, 1922. Tired of the cramped living conditions and exasperated with paying exorbitant rents for ramshackle housing that the landlords refused to repair, Black professionals sought to move away from Black Bottom. That aspiration, however, was fraught with danger. While a few managed to find homes in white neighborhoods, others faced the wrath of mobs and homeowners associations. In the summer of 1925, for example, Dr. Alexander Turner, Dunbar Hospital's co-founder and head of surgery, tried to move into the home he had purchased in an all-white part of town, Tyerman. Within 5 hours of his unpacking his first box, bricks and rocks rained down as a mob of 1,000 strong moved in to drive him out. With Detroit police officers watching, he was compelled to sign a deed and relinquish ownership of the property at gunpoint. The police then escorted Turner and his family back to the Black side of town. Dr. Ossian Sweet, who was also on staff at Dunbar Hospital, like Turner, dared breach the color line in Detroit. It was unclear to him why Black Bottom had to be his only option. He had a medical degree from Howard University, he was married to a beautiful, sophisticated woman, and he was a loving father to a baby girl. Sweet, with his carefully trimmed hair, tailored suits, and tortoiseshell glasses, wanted a home befitting a man who had emerged from the abject poverty of the Deep South to become a physician with a thriving practice in Detroit. He was the embodiment of the American dream. On September 8, 1925, Sweet began to move into his new home on the corner of Garland Avenue and Charlevoix. I think that's how it's pronounced, I don't know. It was a nice bungalow, perhaps the finest house in the neighborhood, though it was no upscale community, but rather a marginal white neighborhood in Detroit. Residents were not college educated. There wasn't a doctor, a lawyer, or an accountant among them. They were pipe fitters, factory foremen, blue-collar workers. The next day, a mob spurred by a number of meetings of the Homeowners Association began to form outside his house. Sweet, well aware of what had already happened to his colleague Dr. Turner, was prepared and had asked his brother to find some friends to help him protect his property. He had first-hand knowledge of what a mob could do. When Sweet was a young boy in Florida, an African-American teenager who lived around the corner from him was accused of rape, tied to a tree, and burned alive. Sweet had also been in Washington, D.C. during the Red Summer 1919, when police allowed whites to rampage for days slaughtering black people. The tide turned only after returning African-American veterans had seen enough, polished their rifles, and began shooting. The next year, Sweet's relatives in Ocoee, Florida, lived in a part of town that whites incinerated in the single bloodiest day in American political history. Whites went hunting for a black man who had dared approach the ballot in the 1920 presidential election, and, in the process, killed scores of African Americans and ethnically cleansed the town until it became all white for nearly 60 years. As a result of his experience, Ossian Sweet had packed, among all the moving boxes and satchels, a small arsenal of guns and 400 pounds of ammunition. Sweet made sure to alert the police that trouble was brewing. Several officers arrived on the scene, but they hung back from the house, even as the crowd continued to grow. Then, as the sun set and two of Sweet's friends arrived in a taxi, the rocks suddenly began to pummel the house on Garland Avenue. Sweet heard angry shouts of, "Here's niggers! Get 'em! Get 'em!" As his friends rushed into the house, the mob was like a tsunami. Sweet saw a human sea. Stones kept coming faster. Windows in the home shattered. Some of the men in the home, including Sweet's brother Henry, grabbed guns, and as rocks continued to rain down, they fired a full volley, 24 rounds. 2 white men went down. One, Leon Briner, a factory foreman who lived just across the street, was fatally wounded. The police, finally shaken out of their lethargy, sprang into action. They stormed the house, arrested Sweet, his wife, and the 10 men who had come to his aid, and hauled them out of there. The Sweets were clearly in trouble, but it was the neighborhood association that had made abundantly clear its main goal to get rid of them by any means necessary, including violence. I really feel for Dr. Turner and Dr. Sweet because in so many ways they proved themselves. They worked hard. They went through education. They got their degrees and they became professionals. And so you would expect with the amount of resources that they've gathered because of their hard work, they'd be able to enjoy it a little bit, right? But the whole time they're facing an uphill battle. I mean, not just because they're Black, but because a group of people don't want them to be integrated with them. And it's out of fear. And I can't tell you how many times I felt like I've experienced that, where as I'm hunting for jobs or trying to get into certain positions, just the simple fact that I'm Black intimidates them somehow. And so they'll package it in a way of, oh, well, you don't fit our brand, or, oh, you're not quite what we're looking for, but don't necessarily provide an explanation. In the same way, these two gentlemen in this story weren't really given a good explanation of why they couldn't live in the homes that they rightfully bought with their own money because of their own resources that they worked for. And that's really sad when that kind of reality continues to happen today, even if it's covertly.
So in this section, we're talking about our experiences. I'm going to talk about my white experience because everyone wants to hear that, because everyone listening to this is probably white. Maybe you can relate with me. Let's relate together. So I have the privilege of a white person. I don't know how else to say it. I was born in a white family who was conservative, and I was exposed to very little outside of what I knew. So I grew up on a ranch in the middle of Texas, hee-haw, and that's what I knew. I knew those kind of white people things. Ranch life was great. I love that I got to do outdoor activities, but we didn't really interact with people outside of our race, mainly just because they weren't there. But I didn't know that there were reasons why there weren't a lot of people of color around me. Well, mainly because I went to a private school where the parents paid for school and there were no Black people at our school. I don't remember a single Black person at my school. In my class, there were 16 of us. We were all white. All of us. So, like I said, I was exposed to very little. But growing up, it really seemed like we loved everybody. So I wasn't looking at people of color and thinking, oh, weirdo over there. There wasn't any hate or malice towards people of color from where I stood. There were lots of jokes about Mexicans where I came from. So it was not really towards Black people that I witnessed racial discrimination or prejudice. It was mainly against Latino or Mexican descent. So the term wetback would be used a lot, and it bothered me because that's not how I saw people as a human being. Even I know that someone could probably look at me like, well, you're conditioned because you grew up in this environment. Well, yes, you are right about that. I was conditioned, but at the same time, personal stances and what I exposed myself to, I did not see people as much different than I was, because I often felt like a failure most of my life and wasn't like I wasn't good enough. So I often felt marginalized amongst my peers because of the way that I looked, and also because I wore a back brace in school. So I often had people of color who were my friends, especially when I was going to school. Before I was going to private school, actually, I was friends with people of color. And I always kind of felt marginalized in my own way, in my own little white girl way. If you want to make fun of it, that's fine. But I did have a lot of people make fun of me growing up until high school. when I was on the swim team and stuff. That was when I really came into myself. But before that, I was made fun of a lot. And so I didn't see people very much differently than me because I never really felt good enough or better than anybody else because I was always just made fun of. So I was put in my place pretty early in life. But it's like awkward laughs. Awkward. I'm white. It's just so awkward for me talking about this because I feel like it's very basic. But in college and beyond was where I started to wake up to experiences outside my own, especially outside of my race. Especially when I started working at Camp of the Hills, and my whole cabin, there would be one white girl in my cabin, and there would be Latino girls, there would be, black girls, there would be, those would mainly be the other races that were in my cabin. I don't really remember if there were any other races that came out to camp, but it was mainly Latino and black Americans. So, but it didn't bother me. I actually really loved it, and all of my kids really loved me and really listened to me, but I was very open with them and who I was, and really wanted them to make sure that they knew that I was no better than them just because I'm this white girl working out at a nonprofit camp for quote unquote inner city kids. So I fell in love with people outside of my race very quickly, just because of how receptive my campers were to me most of the time and how they made me feel amazing about myself. It was like I was finally fitting in for like the first time, and it was my campers that allowed me to feel that way. And so I also remember having to report child abuse and how that impacted me. I think I talked about that in one of our podcasts before. I cried for like 4 hours over one girl that told me her story, and she was in foster care, and so it was really awful what she was going through. And so that was just when I started awakening into, okay, this is so much bigger than this white girl swag over here. Like, there's no such thing as white girl swag because that's cultural appropriation. So it was like, and I was saying things and I was doing things that I didn't know. So I was, like ignorant. I was a very ignorant white person. I was just excited to finally feel like I fit in somewhere. And my dating experience, so after I started my dating experience probably a lot more during camp, and dated pretty heavily with one person in particular who was also black, and I did learn a lot more through him too. So he was also another awakening for me because I got to meet his family and where he came from, and really got to hear about the struggle that he was facing. And I did everything I could to help him, or at least I thought I was doing everything I could, but I just didn't know. And even now, I would say my experience now as a white person is become more of a responsibility to just human beings in general, with the knowledge that I have and with the experience that I have with being married to a black man for almost 5 years, and being in relationships with people of color, for years and years, so like I dated 6 people outside of my race, so there was a lot of experiences that I gained through those relationships in general, and they were all very different people. So a lot of them were black men, but every black man has a different story to tell and has a different experience on the table to share. And so I could never compare one person to the other, just because it's all in the same. They're all experiencing the same discrimination under one umbrella of systemic racism. And it was all these different stories that really inspired me. And I take that with me into everything that I do, including being vegan, and have become I want to be the person that is doing the most good for the world that I know how to. And like Maya Angelou says, if you know better, do better. And that's the kind of person I am. So it really resonated with me. And so, although I have a lot of more experience than most of my white friends, I'm never going to hold that against them because they don't know what they don't know. So right now, I'm just being responsible and sharing my experience and talking with people outside of my race intentionally. And, you know, if I see something on the street happening like I did yesterday with a love affair breakup that I saw happening, and she was black and the other girl was Asian, and I was there and I'm this random white girl, but I'm making sure that both of these women are okay. And I felt really just like I'm just doing the best that I can and making sure that people around me feel safe and feel heard and know that they have white allies that are with them. So I'm not perfect at having these conversations. In fact, I get very defensive and angry, mainly against people who are white, because I'm very protective of my husband and his experience because it's valid. So that is my white girl experience. Thanks for relating with me. This was fun. Got a lot off my chest. Here you go.
Okay.
In March 1981, Reagan assured reporters that he would offer a national drug abuse program that would put its main effort into warning young people about the dangers of drug use, rather than into attacks on narcotic smuggling. But by October 1982, the president had obviously changed his mind. In a gripping address, he explained that a scourge had invaded the nation's borders, taken a hold of American families and children, and was laying siege to the cities across the land. Hardest hit, the president conveyed, was the garden spot of South Florida, which he had turned into a battlefield for competing drug pushers who were terrorizing Florida's citizens. The president then laid out a potent multi-agency strategy using military intelligence and radar that would hone in on drug traffickers and execute brilliant interdiction strikes to cut off drugs before they left other countries' borders. There was just one problem. There was no drug crisis in 1982. Marijuana use was down, heroin and hallucinogens use had leveled off, and even for the first time, cocaine was bottoming out. But as Reagan well knew, such a crisis was certainly coming, for it had been manufactured and facilitated by his staff on the National Security Council, the NSC, along with the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. In these last throes of the Cold War, Nicaragua was the target, but the collateral damage would spray south central Los Angeles and then radiate out to black communities all across the United States. In 1979, after the coalition of moderate and Marxist Nicaraguans overthrew longtime U.S. ally and ruthless dictator Somoza, communist Sandinistas came to power in Managua. Reagan did not see this as a homegrown revolution born out of intolerable conditions of greed, torture, and human rights violations. Instead, he was sure that the Sandinistas were no more than Soviet stooges and coerced by Moscow to foment revolution in America's backyard. The president was therefore obsessed with eliminating the Sandinistas. Shortly after taking office, Reagan ordered CIA Director William Casey to do whatever was necessary to support a small band of anti-Sandinistas guerrillas, known as the Contras, most of whom were strays from Somoza's feared and hated National Guard. In December 1981, Reagan signed a secret order authorizing Contra aid for the purpose of disposing the Sandinistas. The only question was where to get those funds. There was simply a limit to the depths that the CIA and National Security Council budgets could tap into to finance the Contras. Congress, meanwhile, who was already stung by the debacle in Vietnam, was not about to loosen the purse strings. And so, at a December 1981 meeting, Contra leaders, whom Reagan referred to as the moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers, floated the idea that trafficking cocaine into California would provide enough profits to arm and train the anti-Sandinistas guerrillas. With the CIA and the National Security Council now ready to run interference and keep the FBI, the U.S. Customs Service, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, in check, the once formidable line of defense had dwindled to poniest nuisance. Reagan's moral equivalent of the Founding Fathers was now ready to saturate the United States with cocaine. Now, although they had the product, they did not have the distribution network to move the initial shipment of cocaine into the retail markets. They came only when they managed to link up with Rick Ross, an illiterate yet entrepreneurial black man who became the conduit between the Contra drug runners and the Crips and Bloods gangs in LA. The result was nothing less than explosive. For the Contra wholesalers, top-quality cocaine was then packaged and sold in little rocks of crack that reaped more than $230,000 per kilo in retail profit. That's American dollars, by the way. Now, drug money and all its attendant violence pounded on the population with double-digit unemployment and declining real wages. The logistical strength of the Blood and the Crips, with an estimated 50,000 gang members, spread the pain as they set up drug franchises throughout the United States to sell crack like it was on the dollar menu. Soon, crack was everywhere, kicking the legs out from under black neighborhoods. I chose this because like I said, I grew up in a very conservative background, and Reagan was always looked at as a hero. In fact, I feel like my family at one point, some of my family actually met him, and so I always looked at him as this dude that had our backs. You know, he was the first one to say, "Make America great again," and so that was definitely not something that was put into our family's heads, but we just had this high view of politicians. And when I read this story, it just really struck home with me because I was like, whoa, I mean, I don't expect the best out of all politicians, but just to see that, I mean, we were essentially lied to. And then on top of that, his actions affected Brandon's family. And now, like, there's no way that this has not affected Brandon's family. It's just really important to be informed. I want to hear about your experience. I know everybody else wants to hear about your experience. Riley's sighing for you.
Thanks, buddy. So I could literally spend days talking about my experience as a black person. But I think I'm just gonna, for the sake of time, simplify it to kind of these themes that I think make sense of kind of like my overall experience, at least like most of it. So even at a young age, you know, growing up as a black person, growing up in a black family, there were just certain understandings that you had about people. For starters, white people were dangerous. Didn't know why, didn't know how, but white people were dangerous. And not dangerous in the sense of like they'll just come and kill, steal, and destroy at any time, but more so dangerous in the way that they could manipulate you. So already at a young age, I was told and taught to believe, don't trust white people. Now, keep that in mind as I'm like watching TV and all these shows, and guess who most of the characters are? White people. So already having to juxtapose these different positions. On the one hand, I'm being told not to trust white people. Then on the other hand, I'm being exposed to white people who seem trusting. So which side do I go? And I'm like constantly having to weigh that battle day in and day out. And I started at a young age, and I'm still having to do that today, of deciding like, who do I trust? Who do I not trust? Who do I feel safe to be vulnerable around and to talk about my experience and to grow in that way? And then who are ones that I have to protect myself against? And it's a really unfair battle because I come from a perspective where I feel like I should be able to love anybody. You know, it doesn't matter who you are. I mean, I should be able to love you, but already I'm experiencing this barrier of like, how do I even trust myself or trust you? And that just sucks. And I think that just speaks to like the disadvantage that I felt like, and I still to this day kind of feel like I'm in, that for whatever reason things are just like constantly working against the kind of person that I feel like I want to be. Like, I don't want to have these prejudices against people because of like how they look or how they sound, but they come out. I don't want to have to feel as though I have to be like extra on guard in certain situations, or if I have to like speak a certain way or act a certain way. Like, I don't want to have to like be at that disadvantage of like having to constantly be on guard and thinking about things and thinking about relationships. But that's just my reality, and that's been my reality forever from our perspective. And I mean, not just that disadvantage, I mean the disadvantage of like access to resources. I mean, I grew up not in the best housing, but like we made it work. Like relatives, you know, distant family, close family, we're all staying like within the same neighborhood, like right around the corner from each other, and like are sharing resources that we have, which even then wasn't much. And so like having to like face that, and then, you know, education at a public school, which I'll be honest is not the best. I mean, I'm thankful for my experience in a public school, but like definitely could have been better in so many different ways. And I mean, I wasn't aware at the time that it was because of all this systemic bullshit that we face today. But like, again, there's another disadvantage that like I'm having to face like on a day-to-day basis, like not having resources. And so it's just like,
did you go to an all-white or all-black school? Like, what was the majority of the race that you were around?
So elementary and beginning of middle school, it was definitely Black, Latino. But like, I would say 90% Black, like 10% other. So like Latino, white, other races. And it wasn't until, I'm not sure how this happened, but the school system realized that I was smarter than they thought I was. And they took me to go get some testing and discovered that I was quote unquote gifted. Which, when they explained it to me at the time, I was just like, oh, great. So I had these awesome abilities to like do schoolwork, and I was really smart. Great. So I get to go to this better school because of that, right? So like, I'm thinking under the assumption like I'm getting more resources, so I'm happy. But if I knew then what I knew now, I don't think that was the message that they were communicating. I mean, think about it. Here I am at this public school getting like a certain level of education, and it wasn't until they discovered that I had, I guess, more potential that they decided to give me more resources.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of disadvantage that I'm talking about that I have to face every single day. And that's just like one aspect of my experience.
It's like based on your skin tone that they were based on like where you were put.
So my answer is yes. I mean, you think about things like gentrification, you think about redlining, you think about politics around like housing, like, yeah, all of that's kind of behind it. So I don't think it was just about my skills and my talents and like my ability as a student. I think it was something else. Not just wasn't.
So someone else made the decision for you, basically.
Exactly.
You didn't really have a choice.
Yeah. And I don't think my mom had a choice either, even though she knew her baby was smart. So, yeah, disadvantage. So then you throw in this kind of like, this concept of like overt versus covert racism, to where...
Can you explain what those things mean?
Yeah, I was about to where there's like two kinds of messages that I kind of get, or like two sort of ways in which I receive communication. There's the overt way where it is known between both parties, like what's going on. Like, we're staring at this picture. I can overtly make the observation that flower is red, and you would know, the person I'm talking to would know exactly what I'm talking about, because I'm talking about this red flower on this picture that we're both staring at. So that's like overt communication. And so, of course, like overt racism, being called the N-word, being told that I do certain things well because I'm black, or that I should work harder and stop being lazy. Those are like overt forms of like racism. And I mean, of course, being black, yeah, I'm gonna get that, especially depending on like where I was. I mean, you find yourself in parts of the world where the mindset is black people are less than. Of course, I'm going to be called the N-word. Of course, I'm going to be called, all kinds of like coon and, no good, fill in the blanks. But then there's this other form of communication, like the covert, to where, again, kind of going back to this illustration of staring at the picture, I'm sending a message that isn't quite clear, but there's still kind of like this like expectation and this like connotation about it. So like, I'm staring at this picture and I say something like, oh, that's interesting. What the fuck does that mean?
I was just looking at you like, how many times have I heard that one?
But check this. Only people within the group that know what that message means would be able to interpret it. So like, while I'm not overtly saying this picture is shitty, I'm gonna say something covertly that to the people that know me and like are within my group, they will know what that means. So like, that's interesting. They already know like, oh, that's a shitty picture. Whereas if I'm talking to someone outside of the group, they don't know what that means, but it seems like a well-meaning kind of comment. Oh, that's interesting.
And group can mean not just race, but like group of people that you're with, or your family, or the people that you are very connected with. So like, a group of friends come in and say something like that. I mean, just think about teenagers for a second. They're little clusters of teenageness, and like how they click off. And there's usually like the Mean Girls group that would say something, like, oh my gosh, I love your skirt. Where did you get it? And then, they walk away and she says to her friend, oh my gosh, I fucking hate that skirt. Like, just like being nice to the person and then talking crap or not really meaning nice things behind the scenes.
Yep. So again, that's like another facet of my experience as a black person. Throw that on top of, being at a disadvantage, add in this idea of like constantly having to like watch my back and watch what I'm saying and watch how I'm saying it and watch how I present myself, because there's already these like connotations and ways in which, because of like certain parts of me, certain attributes, because I'm black, because I'm a man, because I have long hair or nappy hair, because I wear certain colors or I wear a certain style of clothing,
or because your hair is in
or
dreads,
because my hair is dreaded, and because I speak appropriately and I use like good diction and good vocabulary and I don't speak slang and I'm not finna go do something, like all of these things are like I'm constantly having to be aware of. It's like a hypervigilance in a way. So like, I have to be hyper aware of like what I'm doing, what I'm saying, how I'm saying it. But I also have to be hyper aware of like what you're saying and how you're saying it and like what you're doing and like your position in the room. Like, I'm constantly having to like wonder about that because of just like systemic and like generational perpetuations of like racism and stuff. So for instance, like Beth and I, we could be going to the mall and we're just simply going there to like look around, potentially get some new clothes or whatever. We might go see a movie. We're just like there to like be on a date, enjoy each other.
Simply enjoy them all.
Like, I can't do that sometimes because as we're walking through the mall, like Amy Beth, she's not worried about like how people are looking at her or where the exits are or the tone of people's voices or who's staring at her butt, because like she hasn't been conditioned in that way, and I don't fault her for that. However, I have, because things have happened to me when I've let my guard down, and so I'm hyper aware of like where everybody is at all times. I know what each person is wearing. I know how each person smells. I know where the exits are. I know already like a plan of like how I'm going to de-escalate the situation should I have to. Like, I'm already hyper aware of like so much, and
you shouldn't have to be.
I shouldn't have to be, and yet I live in a society where not only I'm at a disadvantage, so I'm like constantly having to like find a way to succeed from a disadvantage. But now I'm having to like constantly be aware of like my position in the world and the fact that like people hate me and could potentially kill me just for simply being who I am. And that's really sad. And again, that's just like a third facet of like my experience. So you got those three things. Then you throw in this idea of like having to not appear as a threat. Although through history and through education and through experience, you've been told you are a threat. And so I have to engage in this thing called code switching, to where I'm speaking multiple languages at once. And depending on the context that I'm in, certain parts of my language will come out. And so Amy Beth has pointed this out to me on multiple occasions out of curiosity, not like out of being offended or whatever.
Not at all. Because I think it's really cute.
But like when I'm with groups of people, particularly around other, white Americans or around groups of people that I don't know or don't have that relationship with, there's a difference in how I speak. It's very educated, big vocabulary words. There's a different tonality and cadence to it. And I'm really trying to present in this way of like, I am one with you. Like, I am not a threat. So
you tone down quite a bit when we're around white people. And it happens pretty much every time we're around a lot of white people that I see this side of you. And it makes me really sad because at home we're like the goofiest two people in the world and like say the funniest things. Bruh. And we just say things. And there's only very few people in the white community that we can actually be like that with, including my sister and her fiance. Oh. And that's about it. Actually, there's a few more people, but I just can't think about them right this second. Which, don't get offended. Some people get offended. Stop getting offended. Anyways, and it's just like I don't get to see Brandon be all of Brandon when he's around a big group of white people. But when he's around his family, or he's in St. Louis, or he's with his dude friends from college, there is a definite difference, and it's way more fun. Way more fun.
Yeah, and so like it's a way in which I have to protect myself that, again, I feel like goes against, in every which way that I know so far, like the value that I have of just slowing down and just being, like honoring all the parts of me with no shame and like not a care of like how other people view it, knowing that like I'm perfectly made. And yet I find myself still kind of engaging in this kind of like defense mechanism of sorts, and not defense mechanism. Yeah, like not defense mechanism in the sense of like, not wanting to do something I know I need to do. But like you just said, like I just feel torn between these like identities. Like I have to hide one to be able to fit, or to like get the job that I want, or to stay safe, or to have the quote unquote privileges that are out there that I'm entitled to, but because of systemic stuff, I don't get to readily have access to. So another facet of like my Black experience. And then finally just to sum it all up, I told you I could talk to like for days on this one, but to sum it all up, this idea of having to relearn a lot. I mean, I mentioned in a previous podcast that we just recently figured out like my ancestry, and so I'm just now recently understanding the roots of like who I am and kind of like the culture that's been passed down from generation to generation, including, you know, having to migrate and all that great stuff. So I'm having to like honor what I know, but also honor the fact that I don't know. And so having to be content with the fact of I only represent like just a part of what the Black experience could be, and that I have an opportunity to like learn about other Black experiences. And that's really hard, especially in a society and an atmosphere where standing up for yourself and learning about yourself and being passionate about things can often be frowned upon. So here I am as a Black man, understanding my experience, but also, you know, constantly in some ways forced to grow in knowing about more of the Black experience, especially like on a historical part. So yeah, that's just like, it's a rewarding experience, but it's also a very hard experience because it's really hard to do in the kind of atmosphere that I find myself in a lot of the time. It seems like other journeys and other ways of life are quote unquote privileged more so than others. Easier, I guess would be a better word. But yeah, like I said, I could talk for days on just like my Black experience and have all the stories in the world, but to sum it up, I feel like I'm constantly at a disadvantage, both intentionally and unintentionally. There's definitely the overt and the covert racism, plenty of examples there. I have to be hypervigilant, even when I don't want to be, and I think I've realized some of that is related to my PTSD, but I think in more ways than not, it's just related to my experience as a Black person. And then having to learn to fit in a way that seems unnatural, but is necessary for survival. And then I'm still learning about what the Black experience is, was, will be.
Right, because we don't know what it's going to be. Seems like more of the same.
Yeah. And so while I might seem chill and, you know, approachable and stuff on the outside, that's what's going on the inside.
You just dug out your insides and you just laid them out on my white table and got it all bloody. Just kidding. You know, you didn't.
So many words.
I'm trying to paint a picture for our listeners. Just tap the button. We're done with this conversation.
Hold on. It said I gotta type in the password.
Dang it.
Dang.
I'm really thankful for you. You're really amazing.
Yeah. And I mean, as your husband, even being a Black man, I'm so thankful that you're willing to grow with me. Like, we don't ever get to this place, like we've said many times already, to where, oh, we've arrived, we know everything, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. Like, no, you constantly encourage me to grow in what we know and how we, like, show not just ourselves, but, like, our relationship and, like, what it should be about. And, like, I could not have asked for a better teammate in this, like, constant journey of life. Like, you make it all the more worth it. And I love the fact that we haven't fully arrived, because it only just, like, makes the journey more fun with you.
Yeah. And now your family loves me.
And your family loves me.
And it's great. It's all great. No, it's just kidding. It's not all great, but it's mostly good. It's mostly good. It's mostly good. I would say mostly good, not great, but mostly good.
It's mostly great. Not perfect, but mostly great.
I would say good.
Good. What the fuck is that?
Just tap the button. This conversation.